streaming. Facebook streams instantly. YouTube doesn't want to stream until 30 seconds later. Now we're streaming. Okay. I hate trying to stream to YouTube. Well, we wrapped up Amos. We survived 9 chapters worth of Amos. Now we got a relatively short book. Jonah, only 4 chapters. And as always, my favorite thing, what do we do when we come to a new book of the Bible? We do background information. So, yeah, you know, a lot of this is just question mark. We're not given a whole lot to go off of from the book itself. We don't exactly need commentaries to tell us that Jonah is a lot more narrative than it is prophecy. You'll notice that this plays out almost like a play. I mean, very like this reads like something that Shakespeare could have written. Very like tragic hero kind of thing. Although he's not really the hero, but you know, except for the fact that there's like no clear resolution to the story. It just kind of ends. But what do we know about Jonah, the actual person? Jonah the prophet, right? Verse 1, all it says is Jonah, the son of Amittai. Now, that's all we get from Jonah, the book. 2 Kings, however, gives us a little bit more information. In 2 Kings 14, verses 23, 24, and 25, it says, in the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, or Jehoash, king of Israel, became king in Samaria and reigned 41 years. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, whom had made Israel sin. He restored the territory of Israel from the entrance of Hamath to the sea of the Arabah, according to the word of the Lord God of Israel, which he had spoken through his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet who was from Gath-hepher. So, we know that Jonah's prophetic tenure was during the reign of Jeroboam II. Now, if you remember, this was also when Amos, and by extension Hosea, because they were, you know, at the same time, this is also when they were prophesying as well. And so Jonah was active in the northern kingdom because that's where Hosea and Amos were as well. If you remember when we went over Amos, I know it's been a long time ago, but when we went over Amos, we gave it a very, you know, sort of broad date. Part of our dating method was taking the earlier dates for the ascension of Uzziah and Jeroboam II, and then taking the later date for their death. So we took like the earliest possible date for when they became kings, and then like the latest possible date for when, you know, one of them died, and then like where they overlapped. Anyway, basically, it gave us a very broad date range of anywhere between 792 to 746 BC. But that was for Amos. Jonah, right, seems like we're only looking at Jeroboam. So if we're only looking at Jeroboam exclusively, we can narrow it. I don't know that we're really narrowing it all that much, but we can, you know, at least put it, you know, and even then there's, you know, there's some people that argue that Jeroboam started reigning concurrently with Jehoash, and then other people that say he didn't. So, yeah, if he was concurrently reigning with Jehoash, then he would start in 793 to the latest possible death would be 746, which is the death given from the scholars who don't believe he reigned concurrently with Jehoash. If he was the sole ruler of Israel, then it would be 782, which is the earliest possible reign from the scholars who think he did reign concurrently with Jehoash, from when he became the sole ruler of Israel to 746. all that to say, we're just going to go with 782 to 746. This is like basically taking all of those things into account. What is like the earliest possible date that Jeroboam exclusively reigned as king of Israel versus like the latest possible date that he could have died. And it gives us anywhere between 782 to 746 BC. However, this is a date for the events in the book itself. This is the date of the ministry of Jonah, very broadly, the broad date for the range of the ministry of Jonah, not specifically for, not even really specifically for the story within this chapter. That's just sort of Jonah's ministry as a whole, and certainly not the date for when the book itself was written. If we're assuming that Jonah himself wrote this book, which the book itself does not make a claim of authorship, and unlike Amos, this isn't written in the first person. If we're, all of that is sort of like assuming that Jonah's the author. So, what do we make of the authorship of this book? Who wrote this? Well, we kind of have to look at the overall story of the book, because once again, like, we're not given a simple, hey, my name is Jonah, I wrote this book, here's my signature at the end, you can call me at 1-800, overboard or whatever. I mean, so, right, we kind of have to look at the book as a whole to figure out, okay, well, who might have wrote this? And we can kind of determine that if Jonah himself was the author, then this is very unique. The book itself is very unique. The fact that the book is overwhelmingly critical of Jonah, once again, if we're arguing that Jonah is the author, this is very unique because this is not only this level of, one commentator wrote self-deprecation, basically like, bashing yourself, being, so like low on yourself. I mean, it's not really seen anywhere else in the Bible, and really not even seen anywhere else in ancient literature as a whole. Additionally, in chapter 3, verse 3, the verb that's used to describe how large of a city Nineveh was is in the past tense. So, chapter 3 of Jonah, verse 3, Jonah arose and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. And then, now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city. And so people will argue, well, Nineveh was a great city, and then at the time of the writing of the book, it wasn't. The argument was, well, obviously the book had to have been written after the destruction of Nineveh in 612 BC. There's several problems with this, chief of which is that Hebrew language narrative is always written in the past tense anyway, so that itself doesn't even really give us a whole lot. And there's other arguments too that don't even really matter. The point is, we can't really even make an argument for when the book was written, based on anything in the book. I mean, the only thing that we really have to go on is that by the time of Sirach, which is in the Catholic Apocrypha, the 12 prophets had already been established. So the minor prophets were established by the time of Sirach, but that is circa 200 BC. So we're still given a date of anywhere between 782 to 200 BC. If, that's basically anywhere between, like, okay, this was written like immediately after the events of the book and Jonah was the author, it would be like closer to the 782 number versus like this was written a long time later by someone else who wasn't Jonah, closer to the 200 number. I mean, we really have no idea. And, this is an even bigger time span than we gave the book of Joel when we dated it, which is supposed to be the controversial book in regards to dating. The last thing that I want to talk about with the background information is the place or the location that Jonah's message is directed towards. Because, right, this is where at least part of the book takes place, and that place is Nineveh. And I said earlier that Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BC. We talked a lot about Nineveh last year when we covered Obadiah, so I'm not going to hit it a whole lot. tonight. But within the book of Jonah, Nineveh's really only called out very generically for their wickedness, looking at verse 2 of chapter 1. And then by the time in the narrative we actually arrive in Nineveh in chapter 3, all Jonah really says is, "Yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown." We aren't really given a list of grievances in the same way that we were in Amos. When Amos, he's calling out not only Israel, but all these surrounding countries. And he says for 3 sins and for 4, and then he lists what those sins are. So we really aren't given a whole lot about what exactly Nineveh did, other than the fact that they were a pagan nation like every other nation basically was at the time. So the emphasis then is really a lot more on the prophet than the actual prophecy. And this is kind of what I said at the beginning, is, this is a lot more like a narrative than it is a prophecy. A lot more like something out of Shakespeare than something, out of the minor prophets. And people have picked up on the fact and pointed out that Jonah as a book is a lot more in line with, the sort of prophets, like Elijah and Elisha, where it was a lot of narrative and not so much like chapters upon chapters upon chapter of actual prophecy. In the same way that the other 11 of the 12 minor prophets are. So the emphasis is really on the prophet himself, and a lot less on what his actual prophecy is. Really, all he does is, he gives one sentence. Yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. There's your prophecy. There we go. But the emphasis becomes on Jonah and his fall, and then kind of sort of redemption, and then fall again, and then, the story. You've all seen the VeggieTales movie, I'm sure, right? Yeah, totally. You have grandkids.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so we're going to read the first 3 verses, and then after that, verses 4 through 16. So, verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah arose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. It's very hard to say with the double SH. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. I'm going to be doing this all night. Tarshish. The narrative pretty much immediately jumps into the main plot of the story. God telling Jonah, go to Nineveh. Jonah, fleeing to Tarshish. And the book doesn't emphasize Jonah as fleeing from his calling, or fleeing from his objective, or fleeing, from Nineveh, but fleeing from the presence of the Lord in verse 3. And that's pretty significant. There's not really a lot else to say there other than to point that out, but I think that is pretty significant. Let's break this down. We got 2 places mentioned, Joppa and the one that's hard for me to pronounce. So Jonah first fled to Joppa. Joppa was and is today a city in Israel. Today it's better known as Jaffa, Jaffa, but in the Bible, it's known as Joppa, and it's actually mentioned several times. Joshua 19, verses 40 through 46, are talking about the land allotments for the tribes, and it says this: the 7th lot came out for the tribe of the children of Dan according to their families. The territory of their inheritance was, I'm not even going to read all this, blah, 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 and then at the very end, with the region near Joppa, right? So Joppa was part of the tribe of Dan's inheritance, and Dan, if you know your biblical geography, comprised sort of a middle, it wasn't really the extreme southern part, wasn't the extreme northern part, kind of sort of in the middle. So middle of, the United Kingdom of Israel, and obviously was a port town on bordering the Mediterranean Sea. However, Joppa was never actually, it was neither Northern Kingdom nor Southern Kingdom. It was never actually taken by Israel. It was part of Philistia. So Jonah, by the time he makes it to Joppa, is already in a pagan land among pagan people. Jonah then boards a ship and departs to Tarshish. So then the question becomes, okay, well, where's Tarshish? We can find Joppa pretty easy. You can Google that. That pulls up instantly. You can Google Maps your way to Joppa. It's going to be a long swim, but you'll get there. But where's Tarshish? Right? Some people think maybe this is talking about Tartessos of Spain, which is it's basically Atlantis. It's this basically like kind of sort of mythical city described by Herodotus, a city that's either buried or sunk to time. Unlike Atlantis, we do have proof that these people actually existed, so there is that going for it. Um, maybe, who knows, I guess. Some people say, well, maybe this is Tarsus, which is a city in Turkey. Even today, I think that's still a city. Again, maybe. I mean, we don't really know. Interestingly, though, from a linguistic perspective, the word Tarshish, it could be an actual location, like a town, or it could just simply be the sea or the open sea. Not just like, I'm like 20 feet out in the sea, but like I'm in the middle of the ocean and it's going to take a long time to get back to shore, like that kind of open sea. And the Aramaic translation of the minor prophets, called the Targum, actually translates Jonah got up to flee to the sea from before prophesying in the name of the Lord, and he went down to Joppa and found a ship that was leaving to the sea, and he gave the toll and went down in it to go with them on the sea from before prophesying in the name of the Lord. So the idea of sea is, perhaps more appealing than trying to, put this as a specific town. Well, for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, like we said, I mean, that word linguistically can mean that, and other languages pick up on that. Also, Jerome argued that that was the meaning in Jonah, and then in his commentary on Isaiah, he argued that Hebrew scholars define that word as sea. Granted, Jerome didn't come about until you know, like the third and or like the fourth and fifth century A.D. But still, it has that going for it. And then also, right, the idea at play here, if Tarshish isn't a city, but is simply the sea or the open sea, then Jonah essentially took a cruise to nowhere, right? I mean, like they have it. Like you can do this if you so desire. Like some people they'll like take a cruise to Mexico or a cruise to Alaska. I know people they pay like $50. They Friday night they leave, Saturday morning they're back in port. I mean, they just take a cruise to nowhere. They just like ship you out in the middle of the ocean, turn around, come back home. And that's basically what Jonah did. And in a way, that's kind of a more appealing interpretation of this, because if that is the case, then Jonah wasn't concerned necessarily with where he was going, so far as he was removed from any possibility of being able to fulfill his prophetic duty. You know, like I mean, I can walk to the southern kingdom. I can walk to Syria. I can walk to Turkey or wherever, or I can just get in the middle of the ocean, and then I'll for sure be as far removed from the situation as possible. And in a way, that's a lot more appealing. If Jonah simply wanted to vanish for a little while, he could have done so much easier, and without entering, without entering pagan territory. Not that that was inherently dangerous, especially Joppa, because I mean, throughout the Bible, I mean, though Israel never controlled Joppa, I mean, they at least had friendly enough economic relations with them where on numerous occasions goods and supplies were shipped through the Joppa port. So, not that it was necessarily dangerous, but I mean, he could have, taken a vacation to the Southern Kingdom for a while. You know, still monotheistic, still his own race of people, means same culture, but he went to a pagan nation or pagan city, and also, he could have just kind of gone away for a little while without, crossing the ocean, and that's always inherently dangerous, but especially back then. I mean, you know, you thought the Titanic was bad when it came to, how many lifeboats they had. I mean, think about, you know, before Christ, that era. But Jonah wanted to be in the middle of the ocean where there was no chance he would be able to fulfill his prophetic duty of going to Nineveh. And he wanted to get as far away from land as possible, thus the sea. So anyway, if you'll notice on your sheet, I ended this at verse 16. Partly because pretty much every commentary ends their, section at verse 16, and then they group verse 17 of chapter 1 in with chapter 2. And also, I mean, just from like a literary perspective, like, yeah, really 17 and then chapter 2, I mean, go together. Like the narrative kind of naturally breaks after, they throw Jonah overboard, and then it keeps the focus on these mariners. They return, they, offer sacrifices to God, and that's sort of like a natural pausing point before we go back to focusing on Jonah, where we do for the rest of the book. So anyway, that's just where I broke it. Also, there was some stuff that I thought, you know what, I might want to dig into more detail in this next week, and I didn't necessarily think that I'd want to do it all this week and bore you to death. So anyway, be glad. But yeah, we got 4 through 16, and then next week we'll pick up with 1:17 and then chapter 2. So anyway, verse 4. But the Lord sent out a great wind on the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship was about to be broken up. Then the mariners were afraid, and every man cried out to his God, and threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten the load. But Jonah had gone down into the lowest parts of the ship, had laid down, and was fast asleep. So the captain came to him and said to him, "What do you mean, sleeper? Arise, call on your God. Perhaps your God will consider us so that we may not perish." They said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots, that we may know whose cause this trouble has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Please tell us, for whose cause is this trouble upon us? What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you?" So he said to them, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and dry land." Then the men were exceedingly afraid, and said to him, "Why have you done this?" For the men knew that he had fled from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you that the sea may be calm for us?" For the sea was growing more tempestuous. And he said to them, "Pick me up and throw me into the sea, then the sea will become calm for you. For I know that this great tempest is because of me." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to return to land, but they could not, for the sea continued to grow more tempestuous against them. Therefore they cried out to the Lord and said, "We pray, O Lord, please do not let us perish for this man's life, and do not charge us with innocent blood. For you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." So they picked up Jonah and threw him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly and offered a sacrifice to the Lord and took vows. Okay, so we kind of have two reactions to this storm, and you can pretty much pick up where this is going, right? Jonah goes through Philistia, he goes through the pagan territory, sails out of Joppa into, I mean, whether or not Tarshish is the open sea, I mean, that's where he ended up. So yeah, he sails into the open sea, and God obviously doesn't let Jonah off the hook that easily, and God sent a great wind on the sea. And while the ship was, it says, the ship was about to be broken up. Jonah was sleeping. Jonah, popped his Benadryl and he was out cold. Contrast for a moment these two personalities, right? The reaction of the mariners, if we're kind of grouping all of them together, was to be afraid. It says that every man cried out to his God. Further, they were actively trying to save the ship by throwing cargo overboard to lighten, the weight of the ship. Meanwhile, Jonah was taking a nap, right? The pagans, people who are praying, each man praying to his own God, they were aware enough, to know that this storm was supernatural in origin, right? Like this isn't just, you know, they've been sailing quite a while, probably. They probably ain't seen nothing like this. They were aware enough to know this ain't your average everyday storm. I mean, there's something about this. And for all we know, maybe Jonah was asleep from natural causes, but the point remains that the man who's supposed to be a prophet of the true living God is asleep. And the men who, they're all crying out to their own gods, they were awake, not only to, try to throw the cargo overboard and, save the ship, but also to call out to their God. I need a tissue. Real quick. I feel like a teacher. Just talk quietly among yourselves. Like you and I are okay, sorry about that. Right, the prophet who's supposed to be, following the true God, the one that we're supposed to be rooting for, he has no idea what is going on. The men who are pagan and, literally says each man calling on his own God. I mean, among this group of people that we're lumping together, they're praying to, who knows how many different gods. They are awake enough not only to try to save the ship in a literal sense by like throwing cargo overboard, but also aware enough, in a spiritual sense to know, okay, this is supernatural and we need to start, we need to cover all our bases. We're going to pray to every god that we got on our roster. And when the captain wakes Jonah up, he says, call on your God. Perhaps your God will consider us so that we may not perish. And, again, it shows that the captain and the other mariners were aware of the fact that, yeah, once again, this is a supernatural storm. This is a supernatural situation. So it says, who can tell if, well, hold on. It says, perhaps your God will consider us so that we may not perish. And then, right, if you've read ahead, in chapter 3, verse 9, sounds very similar. Who can tell if God will turn away from his fierce anger so that we may not perish? Right? We have this sort of sub-theme running throughout the book of Jonah, where the pagan people are not only aware of and recognize that, okay, well, this is a supernatural occurrence or a supernatural message. They're not only aware of, the fact that it's happening, but they're aware of the fact that, well, perhaps we can reverse this, right? Perhaps the same God who's bringing calamity will also relent from that calamity. So these mariners respond in, a somewhat religious manner because, like I said, they also understand that, the calamity, whatever deity is causing this calamity can be, might also reverse it. So the pagans, they're all, praying, they're covering all their bases. They're praying to every god that they can, including, they're having Jonah pray to his God. Because, right, supernatural calamity can sometimes be reversed. Like I said, Jonah may have very well been asleep from natural causes. The book, never says, he was, God, like, knocked him out cold or something. I mean, yeah, maybe he was just really tired. But I mean, in any case, right? Jonah has no idea what's going on, and then right, his response is, I mean, we're not even really told that he prays to God. I mean, it's pretty much, arise, call on your God, and then the next verse is they're casting lots. So, um, yeah, even if Jonah was sleeping from like exhaustion and not out of, you know, some sort of like supernatural reasoning, his response is far less appropriate, seemingly, than the mariners who, once again, didn't even know God. So, all that to say, next, right, we get into sort of the casting of the lots. All of the mariners and Jonah, they get together and they cast lots to determine whose cause this trouble has come upon us, or who has caused this trouble to come upon us. Jonah apparently doesn't bother to disclose this information beforehand, if you notice. You know, like, bro, you have to know. Like, you have to know that you're the reason for this. But uh, yeah, he doesn't bother to disclose this beforehand. So they're casting lots to determine this, and uh, you know, maybe Jonah doubted that the lot would actually fall on him, right? Maybe he doubted that such a pagan practice could work. Not that casting lots is inherently pagan, but right, I mean, the men who are casting it are also each praying to their own god. So the god to which they're hoping will, influence the lot casting probably wasn't Jonah's god. So keep that in mind. Maybe Jonah thought, well, I mean, you know, their gods aren't real, so it's not like the lot's gonna fall on me. I mean, it's not like they're calling upon the actual God. So yeah, sure, maybe I'm safe. Maybe that's why. I mean, yeah, maybe Jonah was just a gambling man and thought today was his lucky day. Um, right, but in any case, the lot fell on Jonah anyway. Either, you know, um, yeah, I mean, yeah, you got two options and only one of them is really feasible. Either this is like just complete, this is complete sheer luck, and God didn't necessarily directly intervene with this lock casting, and through absolute sheer luck, they eliminated everyone else, and Jonah was the only one left standing, and through God's allowance of this to happen, they it all sort of just miraculously worked out where it landed on Jonah. Or like the more probable option is this was like direct divine intervention from God. So the second option certainly sounds more plausible, you know, from a betting perspective. But we kind of have the thing of like, well, I mean, this is like, kind of sort of like pagan. So like, you know, is God really allowed to work through this? Right. If you remember, we kind of sort of dove into this with Habakkuk. I mean, that was, kind of one of his questions was like, well, how can God punish sin with sin? And, well, I mean, God can't use something sinful to punish sin. And I mean, in the same way, even, though this lot casting, probably was done with the intention of calling upon pagan gods, I mean, God still worked through that. So it's not really any sort of like ethical problem for God. And then further, like I said, lot throwing in and of itself, um, wasn't always done with pagan intentions in the Bible. It wasn't exclusively some sort of pagan practice, but like we said, in this case, it probably was. Exodus 20, 28, verse 30 says, "You shall put in the breastplate of judgment the Urim and the Thummim, and they shall be over Aaron's heart when he goes in before the Lord." Now, that we don't get a whole lot of explanation as to what that is. Maybe he just had really nice jewelry. We get to 1 Samuel 14, and in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. So what I'm reading is an English translation of the Greek translation of the Hebrew. So yeah, that this is why we're not Eastern Orthodox. But anyway, the Septuagint actually gives us a little bit more information about this um, Urim and Thummim. And it says, Saul said, O Lord God of Israel, why hast thou not answered thy servant today? If the iniquity be in me or in Jonathan my son, O Lord God of Israel, give Urim. And if it be in thy people Israel, give Thummim. So the idea here is that these two things that were in the breastplate were actually, used in some way to discern God's will, like casting lots would be. And then Jewish sources actually argue that this method of discerning God's will ceased to be effective once the Babylonian captivity occurred. So basically, this was like, instituted with like the Levitical priesthood, I guess, and continued to be effective up until the captivity. In any case, casting lots or this sort of, using something to discern the will of God is not always used with pagan intention. So it's not necessarily uncommon, and it's also not even necessarily forbidden in Scripture. And Proverbs actually keys us in to the fact that it says in Proverbs 16, verse 33, the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. So it keys us into the fact that, I mean, even lots that are cast, you know, with the expectation that the true God is going to be the one answering it, I mean, it says the lot's cast in the lap, meaning the casting of the lot in and of itself doesn't really do anything. It's God who controls it. And it's the same way here. I mean, even though maybe in Jonah the lot was cast with the intention that a pagan God would direct the lot, I mean, the lot's cast in the lap, but the true God's the one determining the outcome. So, yeah, this was God divinely intervening rather than simply like divinely allowing luck to play out. So anyway, the lot falls on Jonah, and the men once again say, "Whose cause is this trouble upon us?" And it's easy to miss if you're not looking for it, but they had already asked this exact same question in the previous verse. Um, right? They ask, uh, "Come, let us cast lots, that we may know for whose cause this trouble has come upon us." They cast lots, the lot fell on Jonah. Verse 8, please tell us for whose cause is this trouble upon us. Now, that's kind of weird. Why are they asking the same thing twice? You know, that's a little weird. And right, the mariners, perhaps they couldn't really believe that this stranger could have brought such a terror upon them by his own doing. Right? I mean, maybe their line of thinking was, well, is this like you did something or you're like somehow connected to someone that did something, or did you just like tick someone off or something? I mean, basically, like, are you entirely to blame for this, or like are you not entirely to blame for this? um and one commentator sort of, it presents a list of hypothetical questions which should have been running through these mariners' head. I don't know, this isn't Bible, but I think it can be helpful, right? These sort of questions like, well, have we offended Jonah? As the mariners, So then the question is, for whose causes is trouble upon us? Then the question becomes, well, are we somehow responsible also along with you for this, or is this just you, right? Have we offended? Have they offended Jonah? Were they helping him do something wrong? Is it guilt by association? Is Jonah alone to blame? Are they transporting someone who's done a great crime? Or is, the fault really with someone else who Jonah knows, and that's really the source of our problem? And, right, really, I mean, this is a question that they're asking. They're really asking, I mean, um, you know, for whose cause is this trouble? People will, you know, like to argue that, really this is, um, since you are to blame. People argue that this is a statement of blame upon Jonah. Since you are to blame for the trouble that is upon us. Really, that doesn't line up syntactically with the Hebrew, and also it doesn't even line up really with the rest of the narrative, because immediately after that, they just go about asking Jonah questions, trying to narrow down what the cause of this could be. So they are asking, okay, well, the lot fell on you, so who is the cause of this? Yeah, probably because they wanted to know, first of all, I mean, is Jonah wholly to blame, or is someone else that we don't know wholly to blame? And also, two, are we partly to blame for this? I mean, are we being punished, along with this Jonah guy because we're like aiding and abetting a criminal kind of thing? So, right, they ask four other questions after this, and they want to know where he's from. And they want to know where he's from because it'll lead them to Jonah's God, at least Jonah's national God, right? Not that for Jonah that was any different than his personal God, but, we're dealing with pagans here where, you know, your home country can have a God and your family can have a God and you can have a God. It's like Oprah, everyone gets a God. But right, they're thinking, okay, well, if we can figure out where Jonah's from, we can figure out, who's sort of the God of his country, and then we can go from there and try to figure out, how do we appease this God, right? Um, and they want to know his occupation because that could have a direct impact on why they're in the situation they're in, right? Okay, well, we figure out where he's from. I mean, we know what God we need to be praying to, and if we figure out his occupation, I mean, if he is he, a priest? Is he a prophet? I mean, is he some sort of like crooked politician or something? Like what did he do that's so bad that his God is punishing us for it? So they want to know where he's from so they can figure out his God. They want to know his occupation because they're thinking, okay, like he did something that's offending his God. And then right, sure enough, Jonah's occupation is a prophet, although he's never directly quoted as saying that. But the men had apparently heard enough from Jonah's answers to determine that, right, he had, you know, that, well, I mean, it says uh, the men knew that he had fled from the presence of the Lord because he told them, right? He may not have necessarily said, I'm a prophet. God told me to go to Nineveh and I fled. But I mean, he did tell them he had fled from the presence of the Lord. So the mariner's questioning leads to a kind of sort of confession on Jonah's part. Sure enough, Jonah was to blame, and these men were guilty by association, at least in the sense that, I mean, they were going to suffer along with Jonah until they did something about Jonah, you know. So they ask Jonah a question. They say, okay, so what shall we do to you that the sea may be calm to us, right? Um, I don't really think that the idea at play here is that these men were looking for some sort of out to try to, like, kill Jonah. Like, I'm not going to suggest that we kill you, so I'm going to ask you what you want us to do. And if you tell us to kill you, then, like, hey, it wasn't my idea. I don't really think that's what's at play here because, I mean, when Jonah does tell them, throw me overboard, they don't do that. Verse 13, nevertheless, the men rowed hard to return to land, but they could not, for the sea continued to grow more tempestuous against them. So I don't really think they're looking for an out, like, okay, I'm going to, like, plant the idea of us killing you in your mind so you can tell us that. So, aha, it wasn't our idea. I don't really think that's what's at play here. Right? These men didn't know Jonah's God. I mean, he told them, oh, I'm a Hebrew. I fear the Lord, the God of heaven who made the sea and the dry land. That didn't really make any difference to them. They still didn't really know who that was. And part of that is that they didn't know how to appease Jonah's God, right? They may have been familiar with their own gods and what the requirement with their own religion was for making amends. They had no idea when it came to Jonah's God. So, really, more of what they're asking isn't, what do you want us to do with you? Like, do you want us to, like, kill you or, like, not? Because, you know, I don't want to be, I don't want to just, like, kill you without asking you. really it's more of, okay, like, what do you want us to do to appease your God so we don't all die? Is really what's at play here. Um, you know, uh, they they clearly thought that killing Jonah, even indirectly by just throwing him overboard, was too much for them to do. Because, like we said, they originally didn't want to do that, and well, maybe they thought that they would bring sin upon themselves by being indirectly involved with the death of a man, right? And you see this in verse 14, right? They cried out to the Lord and they said, "We pray, O Lord, please do not let us perish for this man's life. Do not charge us with innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." In other words, right, they're sort of saying to God, "Hey, this was your idea, so don't punish us for it, right? This was your idea, this wasn't ours." Um, so, right, they asked Jonah. He says, "Throw me overboard." They don't. The sea gets worse. They can't get to land. They picked up Jonah. They throw him into the sea. Sea ceased its raging, right? After throwing Jonah overboard, these same men, it says, feared the Lord exceedingly and offered a sacrifice to the Lord and took vows, right? So these men actually, you know, they seem to have some sort of religious experience. The question is, did these men actually believe in and worship God, or was this done to try to cover their bases so they wouldn't incur divine judgment in the same way that Jonah had? In the Hebrew, right, and the New King James, and I'm sure every translation picks up on this. I mean, there's emphasis upon the the fearing, right? Like literally in Hebrew, it's like they feared greatly the Lord, right? The New King James, it's feared exceedingly, feared the Lord exceedingly, right? So the idea here is this is moving beyond a simple belief that the God of Jonah exists, which you know commentators have pointed out. I mean, part of their syncretism that you already see within the book is that, I mean, they already in a way believe that Jonah's God exists because they tell Jonah, "Well, pray to your God." You know, I mean, if there's 20 mariners, they're already praying to 20 different gods, so they have this polytheistic worldview anyway. So they're moving beyond that polytheistic worldview where, okay, there's a God in Israel that exists, to, okay, there's a God in Israel, and perhaps he will consider us so that we may not perish. Or, in other words, right, this is moving into a belief that says, okay, Jonah has a God, and he's active within the world, which has already been proven by not only the fact that they threw Jonah overboard and the storm immediately stopped, but even in something like the lots, right? I mean, the lot landed on Jonah. I mean, and you know, Jonah's God was the one controlling it, which was proven when they threw Jonah overboard. So they're moving into a belief from, okay, well, Jonah's God is one of the many polytheistic gods that exist, into, okay, well, there's something special about Jonah's God because unlike other gods, he seems to be directly involved in what's happening here on Earth. This is in no way to make us believe that these men were now monotheistic in any sense. You know, the But the God of Jonah became less of a God that exists to these men to a God that's active within the world to these men. And the fact that these men offered sacrifices to Jonah's God indicates that this devotion, polytheistic and syncretistic as it may be, it at least lasted longer than the journey home, right? They didn't make it safe to shore and say, all right, you know, I never have to think about the God of Jonah again. Right? And I mean, obviously, you can't make a sacrifice on a ship, so you have to get back to shore. So it lasted that long. And also, I mean, they had to travel somewhere to make a sacrifice, right? I mean, they didn't just build an altar on, the dock of Joppa. Um, they probably didn't travel to Jerusalem as much as they did just some other, you know, Yahwehistic altar somewhere. Even, I mean, they even had those in, Philistia. So I mean, they might not have even had to travel far. The point is, it lasted at least until they got to the dock, and then they also had to travel somewhere to give this sacrifice. Um, so right, even though yeah, still probably polytheistic and syncretistic with regards to religion, they at least, kept this, experience with them. It also says that they offered vows to God. Now, don't interpret this as like they took a Nazarite vow or like they became priests or something, right? They didn't do anything like that. The vows that were taken were likely connected to the sacrifices that they made. Deuteronomy 12:6 says, "You shall take your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the heave offerings of your hand, your vowed offerings, your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks." So it's connecting, right, vows with offerings and sacrifices. And then also, verse 11 of that same chapter, there will be the place where the Lord your God chooses to make his name abide. You shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the heat offerings of your hand, and all the choice offerings which you vowed to the Lord. So once again, biblically, vowing was connected to making sacrifice. So it wasn't necessarily a separate act other than the sacrifice itself. Additionally, this could have just been that these men were making vows to make additional sacrifices at a later point in the future, which would also point to, okay, this wasn't a one and done sacrifice to cover my bases, but I'm now incorporating worship of Jonah's God into my normal worship schedule, even though they probably still worship their pagan gods. Right. Psalm 76, verse 11 says, "Make vows to the Lord your God and pay them. Let all who are around him bring presents to him who ought to be feared." Or maybe a better example, that demonstrates the idea that paying a vow to God is making sacrifices is Psalm 116, verses 17 through 18, which say, "I will offer to you the sacrifice of thanksgiving and will call upon the name of the Lord. I will pay my vows to the Lord now in the presence of all his people." So while these men were hardly converted, so to speak, hardly monotheistic in all likelihood, they understood the God of Jonah on a much more personal level than they had before. Jonah's God was not only real in the same sense that their gods were real, but he was involved in the events of the world and thus required sacrifice and worship. And maybe even, if the vows that they took were vows to continue making sacrifices, worship constantly, worship on a regular basis, which would indicate that, yeah, while they were still missing the mark because they were polytheistic, they understood something about God that, the rest of their countrymen didn't, um, because they didn't know God. But anyway, so that leaves us with sort of a completed, narrative structure, whatever you want to call it. Uh, we're done with the ship and we're done with the mariners, and we can put all that aside. And then next week we can pick up Jonah getting swallowed by a whale, and then what happens after that. So anyway, um, and it's 7 o'clock, so it's time to pray.